Hello everyone, welcome to the first part of Mastering the Elevator Pitch. Here I will be introducing you to pitching and then I will discuss why pitching skills are so important. Later in part 2, you will learn about the essential elements of pitching, and in part 3, you will go through an exercise which will help you to prepare your own pitch by yourself. Myself, Vyas, I work as a product design engineer with ITT, and in my spare time I volunteer with ASME and E4C, Engineering for Change. Listen very carefully because you will be learning many important tips to prepare your own pitch. Let's start the presentation. So what is an elevator pitch? An elevator pitch is a short speech about an idea, product or a company which explains your concept very easily to the listener in short period of time. So sometimes people go on speaking lots of information and make things complex. This becomes very difficult for listener to understand. So a good elevator speech should not be more than 30 to 60 seconds. Sometimes we are required to talk technical ideas to non-technical audience. Suppose take an example of freshman year students in a university where professor is trying to teach technical ideas to them. One idea is to use analogies. Take an example like if you want to teach concept of laminar fluid flow in fluid mechanics. So you can compare or connect it with a deck of cards placed on a table and you place your hand on top of it. Now your hand will act as a free state velocity and when you move your hand, the top cards get stick with your hand and it moves along with your hand. And the bottom card which is stick with the table remains at its place. So over here we can compare each and every card in the deck with the molecule layer of the fluid. Another example would be we can compare the motion of excavator with human hand. So by comparing with it, we can easily explain the concept of or working principle of excavator to non-technical audience using human hand. Professor Stephen Hoffenson has some more tips to share on how we can share technical ideas to non-technical audience. So let's see what he has to say.
So I think we've all heard a lot of the same or at least similar advice on how to communicate throughout our academic careers, particularly in the context of delivering presentations. These are things like know who your audience is, avoid jargon, use visuals, use humor when you can, summarize at the end, use that sandwich method, tell them what you're gonna tell them, and tell them what you told them. I think a lot of us have heard this. I think it's very important to use this throughout our lives when we're communicating. So tell me about your work. This is a question that we're going to get throughout our lives in very different contexts. How do you respond to this? Where do you start? How much detail do you give? What does your audience already know? And what do they even want to know? That last question is something you really need to ask yourself as you start to craft a response. What does your audience actually want to hear? What do they care about? What matters to them? Has anyone seen this meme? It's TLDR. It stands for too long didn't read. And this is a trap that a lot of technical people fall into. It would also apply to too long didn't listen. You should be responding to questions with 1 to 2 sentences. No jargon, no acronyms. Let the person you're speaking with respond with their own questions. Now, where do you start? Start from the big picture perspective. You need to tell people how your work fits into the world, how your work affects the broader community. What does it mean to you and me? You are figuring out how to make better fuels to put in our cars. Maybe it's to decrease emissions, maybe it's to help people in developing countries get out of poverty. That is how it fits into the world. People with a non-technical background will hear that and they'll say, oh, I understand what you're saying. Tell me more. A friend of mine who does not have a technical background, but also works on Capitol Hill for a senator, was visiting the NASA Ames Space Center a couple of years ago. And she met a scientist who was working on developing an organic water filtration system. He started out by saying, on a deep space mission where we're sending equipment out for years, maybe even decades, we want our equipment to last a long time. The way that he was trying to figure that out is to use organic or plant-based materials that would be able to repair themselves so they could sustain over these decade-long missions. He also told her that this type of technology is useful in disaster-stricken areas. And when there are shortages of water, like after the earthquake in Haiti, this technology was useful for helping people. She remembered this because he appealed to her emotions. He used non-technical language. She remembers what's important, which is that this is interesting stuff. This research applies outside of space exploration, and it's worthwhile. And as my friend works for a senator who sits on the Senate Appropriations Committee, which decides where money goes, that's a pretty good thing to communicate as a scientist. As a congressional staffer, I meet with lobbyists every day, probably 5 to 10 lobbyists a week. And they all kind of fit into one of two categories. They're either a Bobby or a Libby. Now, Bobby comes into my office. We sit down, and he starts talking at me. He'll tell me who he is, who he represents, the problems he's having. He'll use acronyms and jargon that I might not be familiar with. But basically, 25 minutes in, every time, I'll look at my watch and I'll say, Bobby, we only have the room for about 5 more minutes. So if there's anything else important that you want to get across, do it now. And Bobby will get flustered. He'll look through his notes, and he'll talk a little faster to me for the next 5 minutes. I'll usher him out. I'll be left with a lot of information and not a lot of context on what I can do about it. Libby comes in. She'll talk to me about her trip in, or we'll talk about the weather, we'll talk about where we're from, get a little bit of a personal connection there so that we understand each other. And then we will talk about her issue, and she'll give me a couple sentences, give me the opportunity to respond, and we'll have a back and forth. She'll leave me with one piece of paper that has an infographic or some bullet points on exactly what it is that she would like us to do for her, us being me and my boss, the senator. So she leaves me with a sense that we're engaged, we understand each other, I want to help her. It's very easy to help her because she's done the job for me if it aligns with my boss's interests, of course. I leave a little bit happier than I leave with a meeting with Bobby. There's only really 2 things that I want to tell you, so start paying attention. Number 1, start from the big picture. How do you fit into the puzzle of the world in the space that your audience, your targeted listeners interact in? And 2, what does your listener care about? And craft your conversation around that. Thank you.
So these were some of the important tips shared by Professor Stephen Offenson, which you could apply when you are pitching technical ideas to non-technical audience. There are some more tips like how can you create spark interest in the audience. Stay tuned because this will be covered up in the part 2 of presentation. So what are the important aspects of an elevator pitch? Suppose you are going for an interview. Over there you will be pitching in front of the employer. So you start off by introducing yourself. You talk about your educational background, and then you talk about the projects that you did during the engineering. So basically you organize your thoughts. Keeps listeners engaged and curious. Suppose you are going for an interview for a company which manufactures medical equipments, and you are asked a question, why you did mechanical engineering? So you should answer such type of questions by relating to a story or a strong purpose. So your answer could be like this. I always wanted to develop and design a product which could be helpful for disabled people, and eventually I wanted to contribute to the society. So by this way you keep the listeners engaged and curious. It helps to inform your market. Take an example when Apple launched the iPod, and at the same time another company launched similar device with same functionality. But both the companies pitched their product in different way. The other company pitched like this: 5 GB MP3 player, whereas Apple pitched like this: 1,000 songs in your pocket. So this made much more sense to the people, and Apple got a huge success in selling their products. It cultivates and develops new relationships. So whenever you are pitching successfully, people wants to get connected with you, and eventually your network will grow. And definitely it's a very helpful skill set to boost up your career. So let's see what are the different contexts where elevator pitch can be used. It can be used during the interviews. It could be used during the meetings or social events, during conferences or networking events. It could be used when selling products or services or pitching as a startup company. So in all these different contexts, who would be the audience? For interviews, I would say it would be potential employers. For meetings and social events or networking events, it would be collaborators or colleagues. And when you are pitching or selling products or services, it would be donors or investors. So we just learned that one of the important aspect of elevator pitch, it's a very helpful skill set which can boost up your career. So let's see what Andrea Wesser has to say with respect to startup context.
As engineers, they don't expect us to be good and effective communicators. Working for a startup, you will constantly know at least your technology pitch, if not your elevator pitch for your company. So this is an amazing skill set for an engineer. And you're going to hear me talk about volunteering a lot in this presentation. Always give yourself the opportunity to present in a startup. The other neat thing about this is who you're going to be interacting with. You're going to be interacting with venture capitalists, which seem to look at the greatest deals in the world. These are the people that move money, who had Google founded, who had some of the best renewable energies. Give yourself the opportunity to pitch in front of those kinds of folks, to pitch with customers. You have a much easier setting in a startup because, again, not enough hands to go around to really effectively communicate both your technology or what the company is up to.
So these were some of the great insights by Andrea Wesser, where she insists if you are working as a startup, always give yourself chance to pitch in front of venture capitalists or customers. This will be very helpful for your startup. Planning and practice. Planning is always required in any field if you want to get successful. In pitching, start off your planning by researching the audience well in advance. Try to get idea about the level of knowledge of your audience. Once you are aware about the audience, try to draft your content which is relevant to them by creating basic outline and script. Practice. According to a book, they studied the top performers of the world, whether it be the chess grandmasters, swimmers, or professional golf players. They found out that uh, they put in their 10,000 hours of deliberate practice before they attain the mastery over their skill set. So try to practice as much as you can in front of other people and try to get the feedback. Once you get the feedback, try to improve your content and the length depending on the situation and audience. So here we come to the conclusion of part 1. Let's recap what did we learn. We learned what is an elevator pitch, how can we pitch technical ideas very easily to non-technical audience, what are the various aspects of an elevator pitch, different contexts where elevator pitch could be used, and the last but not the least, planning and practice. So I hope that you all got some important tips to prepare your own pitch. Stay tuned because there are more tips coming on in the part 2 and part 3. Thank you so much.